Hi everybody, welcome back to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. This is another in our series of learning how to tuckerize patterns, which means being able to change and adapt cutting and maybe construction processes to be able to use Studio 180 design tools. We're going to be following up with last episode where we talked about hourglass units, and we talked a little bit about how quarter square triangles are different than half square triangles, and drafted them and understanding a little bit about the drafting, what that means for the starter size squares and how you can learn to recognize whether those starter squares are oversized or not oversized, and then create them oversized by adding a quarter of an inch so you can trim them down and clean them up when you're done. We're going to follow up today and talk specifically about construction assembly instructions that you're given in patterns and how you can make choices with how you go about building those hourglass units. So I need to turn the camera around. Let me take a moment to do that, and close your eyes if you get dizzy, but whoops, sorry about that, gang. Turn this around so that I can drop this down and we can then see our horizontal surface. And here we have, you can see our hourglass units. I think that's pretty straight. Let me get that down just a little bit more. Okay, we'll do our best here. Generally, hourglass units are made in several different color combinations, either just 2 color combinations, 3 color combinations, or 4 color combinations. And depending on whose directions you're reading, sometimes they'll have you do things one way, sometimes they'll have you do things another way. And I'm just going to kind of explain the difference and tell you what I would do in the different situations. So let me clear the decks first, and we're going to take a look at a pattern. This is a pattern that I picked up from the Fat Quarter Shop from their Social Lights quilt-along. And this pattern actually has lots of, let me get it straight there, lots of hourglass units in it. And those hourglass units, what's nice about this pattern, and you can click on this link and print this out yourself, is it gives you instructions for making 3 different size blocks. 3-inch, 6-inch, and 9-inch blocks. And when I look at the numbers for the A and the D, those are the units or the pieces that I'll be cutting to make the hourglasses. And just for example, the 6-inch block, I can see that they've already bumped those sizes up. They're not 1 1/4 inches bigger, but they are actually 1 1/2 inches bigger than they need to be. So the oversizing is there already. Yay, that's a good thing. But then I'm looking at how they're telling me to build those hourglasses. And they're telling me to take each one of those squares, the light and the dark, cut them in half on both diagonals, and then proceed to build those hourglass units. Well, that's not my choice, especially when it's just a simple 2-color option, because it is going to require extra time to do that cutting, a lot more extra time to take those pieces and align them to make sure that they are nice and straight, and to always remember to sew with the same one on top, because if I sometimes sew with one on top or the other one on top, I get pieces that have to be unsewn and put back together in a correct manner. So personally, if it's a 2-color hourglass, I would not do this process of cutting individual triangles. What I would do is what we have you do in the Tucker Trimmer set of instructions. Start with squares. These squares will be oversized, and that's the numbers that are in the pattern. And simply layer the 2 squares together, the dark and the light. Mark 2 stitching lines. And you know, when I mark those lines, I use my quilter's magic wand to do that. And I also use the finest lines that I can. I avoid big, heavy marks, as light as possible, and either a mechanical pencil, a pigment pen, or if I can't see those, I'll go ahead and use a different colored lead in a bow and pencil. So anyway, mark the lines, stitch on the lines, and end up creating half square triangles. Now those aren't trimmed, those are needed to be able to place them together, and roughly line up the edges, but definitely line up those centers. I use my fingers there to make sure that they get lined up properly so that when I stitch, if I've done that, I'm going to end up with that beautiful match in the center of my block. And there you can see oversizing gives me just about a few threads to trim down and clean it up to a perfect size. So 2 colors, that's how I would do that. Now that 3 color unit, basically what happens when you're dealing with the 3 colors, what you're going to need to do is to realize that for each, and you'll make them in groups of 4, but for each unit, you're going to need squares in the same colors. So I'll need 1 square that's white, 1 square that's orange, and 2 squares that are blue. Because the first step in the process is to take the blue and white squares and piece them together into those half square triangle pieces, and piece the orange and blue squares together to create those half square triangle units, not trimmed down, but taken then and layered together, lined up so that the seam is running in the same direction and that they're nested beautifully at the center point. Use your marker, mark, stitch, and press, and end up with your oversized unit, because my starting squares are always oversized. And you know, there's one other thing you may or may not realize, but hourglasses are a perfect candidate for spinning seams in the back. And if you've not done that before, check out one of my earlier videos on how to do spinning of the seams. It makes for a nice flat intersection there in the middle, and then trim that unit down so that, and when you do that, when you start with the 4 squares, you'll actually end up with 4 of these units, which is how they're frequently used in our patterns. Now, every once in a while, you're going to come across a pattern that requires you to create those hourglass units in a very specific color arrangement. And my solitaire pattern is a prime example of that. This is one time where you will need to cut each one of the triangles individually so that you can place them in the specific order that they need to be able to pull off the block direction. So your first step, as always, would be to oversize the squares, and you need 1 square for each color. Cross cut the quarter square triangles out of each square, and then carefully put them together in pairs. Put these 2 together into a pair. Put these 2 together in a pair. Pay attention to your pressing. You're going to have to plan to press either toward the red or toward the orange so that when you line them up, the seams are going to nest. But one of the reasons I don't do this on a regular basis is I've got a long unsecured bias right here. And if I'm in a hurry or if I'm heavy-handed at the iron, I can actually press those shapes kind of out of whack. But create those hourglass units oversized, and you still have that little bit of wiggle room that you can use to trim things down and clean them up and make them fit perfectly into your projects. Now, there's couple other things I'd like to talk about here. This is a great pattern. It is also a free download that you can print off, and it might be a perfect opportunity for you to use your tuckerizing skills that we've talked about in the last 2 episodes. The block is called, or the quilt is called Life's a Picnic, and that link is also on our description, so you can just click on that. And it will have you making 12-inch blocks using half square triangles and using hourglass units. And you know, it's not been tuckerized. So this will give you a chance to see if you can put what you've learned into play, and then maybe give yourself a challenge and say, you know, instead of making a 12-inch block, see if you can tuckerize it and make it a 9-inch block, or change the directions so that you can make it a 6-inch block. Knowing how to do those simple steps are going to be great practice, great skills to have going forward. And you know, if you really don't want to do tuckerizing at all, you can always pick up patterns from us. Bread and Butter was the first pattern I ever wrote. It's full of hourglass units. The solitaire pattern you just saw me talk about, and even the Rangeley series of patterns. The Rangeley wall, table runner, and large quilt all use hourglass units. They may not look like hourglass units, but they definitely are indeed hourglass units. And I'm going to take and turn this around a little bit and slow down when I get to the long arm, and you can see samples of those patterns. You see the Bread and Butter, some spring table runners on the right. You see solitaire in the middle, and there's a newer model of my Rangeley stars. And you know, I like all my units, but these are ones that you are going to see on a very regular basis. Sorry, gang. And so that's it for today. Oh, what I want you to do is hopefully download those free projects and maybe pull out some of your, I always call it my wonder fabric. You wonder what you were thinking when you bought that fabric. Oftentimes when you're learning a new skill, that's a great time to use some of that fabric, because if it doesn't turn out, you can go back and try it again and put those knowledge skills to work. So you take care, everybody. I'll see you in a couple weeks for the next tips and tricks. Bye.